Let us look at the interesting subject of eyewitness fallibility. The Department of Justice Studies has established that the principal mechanism by which people are wrongfully convicted and sent to prison and then are subsequently exonerated by DNA evidence, they were sent away on the strength, largely, of persuasive, sincere, but hugely erroneous eyewitness testimony. Eyewitness testimony is that which is revered by judges and juries alike because all parties intuitively believe that, my goodness, if he saw it with his own eyes, that must be what happened. If she saw the man who did this to her, who better to testify, yes, that's the man, I'd recognize him anywhere. So intuitively, it makes sense that eyewitnesses are reliable, even though the science demonstrates that they are, in fact, among the least reliable kinds of evidence a jury has to consider. Now, it's a real challenge, if you can imagine, for attorney and psychiatrists alike to deal with that intuitive conviction. Intuitive convictions are very powerful. For hundreds of years, people believed that the sun revolved around the earth because they saw it arise in the east every morning and settle in the west. Now, of course, we know that that's not true. Well, most of us do, other than a few stalwart members of the Tea Party. Most of us now believe in a heliocentric view of the solar system where the earth revolves around the sun. But intuition is a tough thing to overcome. And to do so in dealing with a articulate and persuasive eyewitness, we have to demonstrate to the jury first the fallacies of memory, and then all the things that can go wrong during the process by which an eyewitness makes an identification. Now, there are two kinds of memory: short-term or immediate memory and long-term or remote memory. They're very different. In fact, they are controlled by two very different parts of the brain. Now, short-term memory lasts about a minute and a half, and it can hold in that minute and a half about a dozen items. By contrast, long-term memory can perhaps hold an infinite number of items and arguably hold them forever. An example of short-term memory: you want to make a phone call. You don't know the number, so you dial 411. You get the information operator. She gives you the number. You're just about to make that call when your kid comes up and says, Daddy, can I have 25 cents for ice cream? Daddy, can I have $5 for ice cream? You give the kid some money, then you go to make the call, and the number is gone. You didn't write it down. You have to call the information operator to get it again. You didn't move that memory, those 8, 10 numbers, into long-term memory, and so it's gone. So that's an essential problem with the eyewitness. Are they able, are the circumstances such that they can move what they've got in their short-term memory into their permanent memory banks? The process by which an eyewitness makes identification is 3 stages. Perception is the first stage, where the eye, perhaps aided by the other senses, smell, sound, touch, makes that initial picture of what it is that's going on. The second stage would be storage, where the brain now files away whatever the eye took in and files it away until such time as you have to retrieve it, which brings us to the third stage, the retrieval stage, where the witness then rummages around in their memory banks and expresses what it is they saw or thought they saw. And in each of these 3 stages, perception, storage, and retrieval, things can go wrong. Let's look at perception. Now, when we put aside the obvious factors, was there enough light? How much time did the witness have to observe the event? How close were they? Did they have their glasses on? Putting those physical factors aside, the most important elements determining the reliability of the witness during this perceptual phase are the state of mind of the observer and the events being observed. That if the observer is too engaged in what's going on, or at the other end of the spectrum is not sufficiently attentive, you don't get nearly as good a record up here as if you would in that middle Goldilocks stage where they're engaged but not so engaged that their eye essentially blanks out. And this may be why somebody watching a crime taking place from across the street may be a more reliable witness about the face of the person committing the crime than the victim, him or herself, because the victim is so engaged in what's happening and their anxiety level is so high that, in effect, it short circuits the ability of the eye to pick up the nuances of the face of the person committing the crime. Here's a real crime example. There was a bank robbery a year or two ago. This chap walks into the bank. He's got a gun underneath a newspaper. He walks up to a teller and he says, "Give me all your money." She does. He's right out of there. The police show up within 4 minutes. They ask the teller what this guy looked like. We can see on the television a rough outline. It was a figure, but tell me what his face was like. He was right there in front of you. She couldn't describe him. Couldn't say a thing about his face, his nose, his eyes, his hair. She could give a very detailed description of the gun he was holding on her, but nothing at all about his face. So the police turned to the teller next to the one who had been robbed and asked her to describe the robber. He was no better. She didn't even realize a robbery was taking place. She saw that guy. The robber is just one of 50 customers in and out of the bank that day. She was insufficiently attuned to what was happening. The first teller who was robbed was over-engaged in what was happening. So you want that middle ground in order to achieve an optimum recollection, at least at this first perceptual stage. There are other ways in which the witness can be misled. Weapon focus is one of them. We saw that with the bank robbery, where the presence of a weapon will absorb a disproportionate amount of visual energy at the expense of the eye picking up facial details. Cross-racial identifications are less reliable than when you're identifying someone of your race, because skin color, again, absorbs a disproportionate amount of perceptual energy from the eye. So you say, oh, it was this Mexican guy or this Asian guy. Well, there are a lot of Mexican guys and a lot of Asian guys out there in California. That's useless. Whereas if it was a white guy and you happen to be white, he won't even mention that. You'll instead get to the nitty-gritty, which is what his eyes were like, his hair color, any scars, and so on. So identifying people of your race tends to be much more reliable than when you're making a cross-racial identification. And there's one more factor that can mislead the eyewitness at this perceptual phase. And that is that people tend to see what they expect. Here's an example. There was a study in which 100 subjects were shown a color photograph of a half a dozen blonde people in a room, and a half hour later they were asked a number of questions, including, well, what was the eye color of those blonde people you saw in that photograph? Well, a substantial minority remembered the eye color of those people as being blue or maybe green eyes. In point of fact, every one of them had brown eyes. But you see, we tend to expect people who are blonde to have light-colored eyes, and that's what they saw. They saw what they expected. In another study, again, subjects were shown a photograph of 3 people in a New York subway car. A white man, an African-American man, and a white woman. The white man had a knife half hidden under his jacket. A half hour later, these subjects were given a quiz. On the quiz was the question, who had the knife? And once again, a substantial minority remembered the knife being in the hands of the black man, even though in point of fact it was being held by the Caucasian guy. By the way, a number of subjects were people of color, and they too saw what they expected, which was the black man had the I'm quite certain that former Vice President Cheney really did see a deer out there when he blasted his buddy on that hunting expedition. We see what we expect. The second phase of the eyewitness process is the storage phase, where you file away whatever it is you think you saw. And at first blush, you think, well, this is safe. This is a dead phase. You take a photograph, you put it away in a drawer, and you expect it to be there 10 years later, pretty much like what it was when you put it away. Well, that may be more or less the case with photographs, not so with memory. And the first thing that happens during the storage phase is decay. I'm sure any of us, were we to take a geometry exam today that we creamed back in high school, today we would all flunk, unless perhaps we crammed the night before, like doubtless we did back in high school. Well, I guess you would expect that. What you wouldn't expect, however, and you certainly wouldn't get with a photograph, is that memories not only decay, but they get moved around, they get shifted. If you, 10 years ago, took a photograph of the family around the Thanksgiving dinner table, you might, after 10 years, see a bit of decay in the photograph. It may fade a bit, especially if it was a Polaroid. But you wouldn't expect to see Aunt Sally sitting at that dinner table because Aunt Sally died 5 years before. But in memory, that sort of trick can occur.